know you love to go over those plans and blueprints and stuff.
Mr. Chair, you are now live.
Well,
All right, good evening, everyone. Welcome to the City of Annapolis Board of Appeals special virtual meeting for April 19th, 2021. This meeting is being broadcast on the City of Annapolis YouTube channel. My name is Bob Gallagher, Chair of the Board. This virtual format allows the public to observe the meeting through video link, submit written comments through the City of Annapolis website, links to the YouTube channel, the comment form on the city's website, and to the case file for the cases that we'll be hearing tonight may be found on the agenda for tonight's meeting. People that you see on the screen are members of the board. When a case is called, representatives of the parties to the case will also appear on the screen. Also participating in the meeting are General Counsel to the Board of Appeals, Cheryl Woods, our Recording Secretary, Tammy Hook, our technician tonight, Julian Jock, who's managing the broadcast. Also participating may be representatives of the city, including Dr. Sally Nash, Director of Planning and Zoning, Joelle Braithwaite, Esquire, Assistant City Attorney and Counsel to the Department of Planning and Zoning, Jacqueline Rouse, our liaison to the board, and one or more members of the planning staff involved in the particular cases. We ask everyone but members of the board to mute their audio. If anyone else wishes to speak during the meeting, please raise your hand and I'll call on you to speak. Written comments on matters before the board tonight that were submitted up until noon today are made part of the record and have been forwarded to the members of the board and the parties in advance of the meeting. In order to allow additional comments in response to matters that arise during a hearing tonight, the record may remain open in those cases in which evidence or argument is received tonight until our next meeting on June 1st. So anyone can comment on those cases up until noon on June 1st. And those comments will also become part of the record in that particular case. So let me remind everyone that communications with the board about any case by anyone other than a party to the case must go through the comment form. All communications by parties to the cases must go through the board's liaison, Jackie Rouse. No one should contact any member of the board directly under any circumstances about a case. So tonight we've got a variance application relating to, I think it's 1001 Marsh Haven Court. We've got oral argument on an appeal relating to 424, 428 4th Street. We've got a discussion of proposed changes to the board's rules. So we'll start the meeting with a call of the roll by our recorder, Tammy Hook. Tammy, please.
Mr. Gallagher,
Yes.
Mr. Zazali,
here.
Mr. Burnett,
Present.
Mr. Dews,
Present.
Mr. Walsh,
Present.
Dr. Chen.
Present.
Great. We have not only a quorum, but a full house. Have the members of the board had a chance to review the agenda? Good. I wanted to propose an amendment suggested by staff that we hear the variance first. It's not expected to take very long before we get into the probably more extended argument on the appeal. So may I have a motion to approve the agenda as amended?
I move that the agenda be approved as amended.
Second?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Oh, thank you. Next item is approval of the minutes for April 21st. Are there any corrections or additions to Tammy's perfect minutes? No?
I rely on Dr. Chen for all my edits.
May I have a motion to approve the minutes? Don't
Somebody,
be shy.
Nadine, it's your purview.
Oh, I move to approve the minutes of April 21st.
Is there a second?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Thank you all. So the first item, we'll ask Julian to bring in the parties to variance 2021-003, application for a variance to allow reduction of the waterway yard setback at 101 Moss Haven Court. Welcome, everyone. All right, let me ask anyone who may be called on to give evidence on this variance application tonight to please raise your hand. Any hand will do. Do you swear or affirm that, subject to the penalties for perjury, that the evidence you will give tonight is the truth to the best of your knowledge?
I do.
And I do.
I
All
do.
right. Thank you. So I think I heard earlier before we started the meeting that there have been no public comments on this. Is that right?
That's correct, Bob.
All
This
right,
is
thank you.
Cynthia Gadenia's staff of planning and planning.
Would you like to introduce the case, Cynthia?
Sure, I would like to do that. As you said, this is variance case VAR 2021-003. It's for property located at 1001 Moss Haven Court. The property is owned by Brett G. Davis and Jessica L. Tavasti as trustees. The property is zoned R2. It is located in the critical area with a designation of LDA, which stands for Limited Development Area. It also has a 100-foot buffer, which is a modified buffer area designation. As you noted, that this variance application is for a reduction to the waterway yard setback. The waterway yard setback is a calculated averaging of setbacks along the waterfront 300 feet from the subject property. That was determined to be 57 feet. However, the code section says that if the calculation of the waterway yard makes the property unbuildable, it can be reduced to 30 feet, which is what staff did. However, the items of the subject application are closer than 30 feet. They're as close as 12 feet. The application is to replace existing deck and stair structures and retaining walls. These are all deteriorating. The project also includes some slope stabilization that needs to be done. That's not really part of the variance, but it is part of the project as a whole. That part of the project will require a grading permit down the road. The project, since it was in the critical area, has been reviewed by the Critical Area Commission. There's a email copy of their response to the review. They have no objections to the project. Let's see what else. The property was posted with the public notice sign. The mailing notices were sent out. The newspaper ad was put in the paper, and there have been no comments to date for this project.
All right, who would like to present on behalf of the applicants?
I will be presenting on behalf of the applicants. My name is Spike Meatyard. I'm with Campy and Ruby Landscape Architects. Cynthia, thank you for the introduction of the project.
But Mr. Mealyard, let me give you a little advice. This board is very conscientious. We've carefully read the staff recommendation, which addresses each of the criteria. We've read your application and all of the attachments to that, which also address the various criteria. And so we certainly invite you to tell us anything you think we need to know that's important that might not stand out from the application, but generally we've read everything, and if we have questions, we'll certainly ask them.
Understood. Thank you, Bob. I would just like to continue off of Cynthia's introduction and explain the request. I will share my screen to show the. Can you guys see my plan there? L-002.
Yeah.
Okay, great. So the request is to ask for a variance to reduce the adjusted waterway yard setback 18 feet. As Cynthia explained, the existing average waterway yard setback is 57.5 feet. We have an adjusted waterway yard setback to 30 feet. However, the existing deck and stairs that we're asking to replace in place is 18 feet closer to the water. So we're asking for a variance of 18 feet in order to remove failing stairs and a deck that is currently rotting. The deck was built about 40 years ago, and it's probably stood its last day, coming soon. We would also like to replace these steps here, which are over top of a failing slope and are becoming unsafe as the slope deteriorates and the stairs deteriorate as well. So so we're asking this variance because we would like to replace everything in its current footprint. Please note that the existing deck and steps were constructed a long time ago. So as these pictures will show. Here is the proposed plan here to rebuild these steps here, and replace the deck in its current footprint. Important that we replace components in the landscape. Their children and any visitors that may come by. It's typical to do property upkeep, so we want to make sure that the property is maintained and cared for, and to protect against any further erosion or utilization of the existing steep slopes. Our criteria, I believe that we meet all the criteria that the board requires. There's a hardship due to the waterway yard setback. It's unique due to its setback and location along the creek. It is not for financial gain. The hardship is not because of something that the owners have done. And it is non-detrimental to the neighbors, as it is part of the character of the neighborhood. And it does not restrict light, or we are not asking for anything above and beyond what is already existing.
Great.
Thank you.
That's very helpful. All right. Questions from the members of the board for staff or for the applicant?
Bob, can I go?
Yeah, please.
This is a couple quick questions. Staff, whoever wants to answer it. I looked through the packet, but I didn't see it leap out at me. All of this was back in the mid or early 80s. But does the city have any records that it was properly permitted and built?
I do not. Excuse me for interrupting, Christian. No, there is a file for this address, but there's nothing that shows the construction of the house or the decks or anything at any time. And our electronic records don't go back to that point. And so I could not locate any permits or anything for any of the structures.
But I'm okay. In the absence of that, there's no evidence to suggest that it's not contemporaneous to the construction of the house, right? It looks all old and it goes back.
It looks like it needs to be repaired or replaced, yes.
Okay. Second question, the owners are, not that this is a bearing, but it's just a matter of curiosity. The current owners have been the owners for a while, or are they new owners?
I don't know how long they've been the owners, but I'm sure they can answer that. I do want you to note that, the uniqueness of the shape of the lot, that's
Yeah.
one of the criteria. So,
Yep, none of that. I don't think I'm questioning any of that. Maybe my colleagues will, but, and then my
yeah,
last
just pointing that out.
point is really not a question, but a point for the applicant and the designers that, thank you for preparing very competent and well-presented documents and photographs. And we don't always get this far along with our packets. But whatever this board reviews and decides here, we're not commenting on the constructability, the engineering, the railings, the footings, none of that is our purview. That's a separate process. We're just addressing the variances here, just as a point of clarity.
Did you want to ask the owners how long they've owned the property?
Just curious how, I mean, you've done well by getting all that stuff to last from the 80s. Normally it doesn't last that long.
We've lived here for 3.5 years. It'll be 4 years this summer.
Yeah.
This is our forever home, and we do have a 2-year-old, so
Yep.
you need to keep him safe.
Did you recognize that this was part of the package here, that you'd have to redo all this, or?
Yes, we did. We did have an engineer come and tell us this when we.
Okay, I'm glad it's not as a surprise. Okay, that's it for me.
Other questions from members of the board? I can't see everyone, so you'll have to speak up.
Yeah, this is Nadine. I do have a question, Cynthia, with regard to the uniqueness. I'm not familiar with other plots of land around this location. Can you please speak to what other plots are around this address?
I'm not sure I fully understand your.
Well, are they,
question, most property, there you go. That's a great thing. That's a vicinity map, maybe.
Oh, okay. Oh, right. This was in our packet, right?
Right. That's part of your packet, right?
On page 41 for your reference.
Most lots tend to be fairly rectangular. I mean, you get a few differences in that, and certainly along the water line, you won't get, straight lines, obviously. But this is really more of a pie-shaped lot that is pretty unique, very triangular, not your usual rectangular lot.
And can you also speak to the slope? It looked like from the photos that it's very steep, and that also creates a problem.
That is correct. That's why I brought up the fact that it will need a slope stabilization project that is also part of the overall scheme of this project. That part doesn't need a variance to do that. And we've been in contact with the critical area. And like I said, they've reviewed it. Critical area staff has reviewed it, and it will need a grading permit when it gets to that point. But since they're going to be tearing down the deck and those steps, and they're more than 4 feet off the surrounding ground, then those have to meet setback requirements because they're fully demoing them. They're not just, replacing the decking boards or the railings. They're pulling the whole structure down and rebuilding that.
Okay, thank you. And then lastly, maybe Spike can speak to this. The decking will be what material? Will it be solid? Will it be slats? And the stairs?
It'll be of similar character of what is existing. There be at a minimum 1/4 inch gaps between every board.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you, Nadine.
Anyone else? I've got a couple. For the applicants, have you all considered, you're redoing that parking area, I believe? Have you considered pervious pavers for that area?
I'm going to have to defer to Campion Ruby.
Happy to take that one, Jessica. Thanks. We have considered the use of them. However, we are managing the stormwater management off of the parking area using a series of stormwater planters before it reaches the steep slopes. So the answer is yes, we have explored the options, and we have decided not to go with the pervious pavers and to treat the stormwater using planters instead.
Okay, we can't require you to do otherwise, but more treatment's always better than less treatment. Looking at this drawing, it looks like the limit of disturbance intrudes into the right-of-way. Is that correct?
It comes out into the street to replace some pavers that are existing in the right-of-way.
Yeah.
Sorry, let me interrupt you just for a second. They will have to meet Department of Public Works standards for reconnecting the driveway to the roadway.
And that has been addressed in a comment from the city prior.
And am I reading the drawing correctly that one of the retaining walls that you're not really addressing, you're not really changing here, but also intrudes over the property line into the right of way?
We are not touching any of this area here. This is existing, and we are going to leave it there.
But it is an intrusion into the right of way?
According to, yes, it is.
Okay. I'm wondering, Cynthia, does the city have any process for, I'm assuming as the holder of the right of way to approve these things?
I believe I spoke to Department of Public Works about this. There's a number of retaining walls that are within right-of-ways. You can think of areas within potentially in the historic district where people even have, their retaining wall and then steps going up to their property. They generally are fine with those. I can certainly, during the permit process, make sure that they're aware of that. And if there's any kind of easement agreement or something that they would want, we can address that at the time of permitting.
For people who have been paying attention to issues in the city these days, there's a lot of focus on water access. So I guess with these existing intrusions and more work that's going to be done there, would the applicant be agreeable to a condition that the owners will not do anything to impede or discourage public use of the right-of-way?
Bob, I don't believe the Moss Haven right-of-way goes all the way to the water here. Moss Haven is a very short dead end, and I don't think that right-of-way ever has gone all the way to the water, but we can look at that issue. This house was built in 1981 prior to the adoption of critical areas, and I proffer that only in response to Christian's questions about the history of the property.
Thank you.
So, but I don't think it goes. Do we have a?
I think it does go to the water.
There is a lot of trees and things to make it a bit challenging too. And I see Bill's hands are up, so.
Yeah, I'm looking at the plat and the right of way does go to the water.
And do you have a plat reference number for that?
That is JHH 207 folio 383. It is plat B of Moss Haven.
Yep,
Okay.
and this is not going into the right of way.
I understand. You know, we'll be closing the record on this case, not too long, I hope. And we'll resume on April 1st with our deliberations and decisions. I don't need an answer now, but if you can give us an answer by April 1st, whether you'd be agreeable to that condition, that would be helpful to me.
We can also look at the plat to see what kind of, if there anything is, on the record plat as it sometimes is with other record plats that, that addresses this issue of water accessibility.
Do anything you want to be helpful, but I'd like an answer from the applicant.
Okay.
Bob, just to correct you, it's June 1st, not April 1st.
I'm sorry. I'm going backwards.
And I believe you opened up in your introduction that this was April 19th, and it, just to correct it, it's May 19th. So
yeah,
you've got April on your mind. Time's flying.
Must have been a great month.
There isn't like a street end park or any direct access that I'm familiar with at the end of the street. As the owner said, there's kind of steep slopes and a lot of trees and undergrowth vegetation in that area. But
I'm sure some of the people on that street like it that way. But I'm not sure it's not going to change at some point because of the emphasis on water access. That's what I'm getting at.
Well, we also need to look at whether or not this is.
We'll find out about the right of way or private right of way for you.
Mr. Chairman.
Great. I thank the Campton folks for their very competent work and presentation, and Ms. Davis for her candid responses. We'll close the record until we resume on June 1st to make a decision. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
All right, Julian, if you'd like to bring in the parties to 424-28 4th Street.
And while he's doing that, we'll go ahead and put the staff report in as Exhibit
yes,
C.
thanks, Terry.
And then the variance application in as C2.
Right. All right, do we have everyone? I see we've got Mr. Nelson.
Present.
We've got Mr. Christoph. Joel is here. Okay.
Hey, Bob, you want to let the others know they can leave?
Yes, anyone who is involved in the variance is excused. Thanks very much. So I think the order we discussed previously we'll stick with, which is appellants, applicants, the city, and we'll have a brief rebuttal by appellants if necessary. So, Mr. Nelson.
Thank you. Good evening, members of the board. Mason Nelson on behalf of the citizen appellants in this case. I have before me now the board's scheduling order dated April 7, 2021, in which the board set forth the issues for briefing, and both parties have briefed those issues, and now we're here to argue the issues in the scheduling order. The first question, of course, is whether the grant of the special exception was consistent with the denial of the variance to allow the required parking. The answer is no. Let me go back and summarize some of the key facts that I think are relevant to the board's consideration. That The applicant filed an application for a variance in September, an amended application in September of 2018. The applicant applied for variances, including variances from section 21.66.050.c for 9 parking spaces under the second floor of 424 4th Street. That's what the application applied for, in part for the variances. Staff report summarized the rest of the requested variances, including the variances from section 21.66.05c.c for the same 9 parking spaces under the second floor of 424 4th Street. That's in the staff report at 14. So what we have is an application for a variance for 9 parking spaces beneath the building. The staff report summarizing that application, and then we litigated that issue before the Board of Appeals. And in the board's opinion, at pages 1 and 2, the board summarized the 4 different variances that the applicant was seeking, including the same variances from section 21.66.05.c for the same 9 parking spaces. So the applicant applied for it, staff summarized it, and the board denied it. Now, and just to summarize, I'm going to repeat history that everyone knows here, but the board denied the 4 variances, approved the zoning boundary adjustment, and approved with conditions the application for special exception. And so what we're confronting here now is, how do we reconcile the board's denial of variances with the approval of the special exception with conditions? But the board disapproved the variances for 2 fundamental reasons. One, the applicant failed to prove the hardship requirement. That's at the board's opinion at page 4. And second, the applicant failed to prove the uniqueness requirement. That's at page 5 of this board's opinion. Then there were petitions for judicial review. The applicant applied the variance, appealed the board's ruling on the variances to the circuit court. My clients appealed the board's rulings on the special exception and on the zoning boundary adjustment. The court affirmed the board's denial of the applicant's 4 variances. The court affirmed the denial and remanded the special exception case back to this body to resolve the disconnect with regards to the board's granting of the special exception. And this is the words of the circuit court: because the board failed to make the necessary affirmative factual findings in its decision to explain how the special exception is permissible in light of the denial of the parking variance. And that's because the only evidence in the record was that they needed this variance to satisfy the requirements for the minimum parking places.
All right, we're all familiar with all of that. Let's get to the point.
My point is, there was no appeal by the applicant of the variance ruling by the circuit court. The circuit court's ruling on the variance case is a final judgment. It's the law of the case that controls this board's resolution, I think, of the issue before the board here. So we assert, if it please the board, that the board incorrectly approved the special exception because without the variances, the subject property would not have sufficient parking necessary to grant the special exception. Ms. Rouse said as much in the transcript, page 99. I don't see how they can meet the parking requirement without the variances. We assert that this court has one option. Given the fact that there's a final judgment on the denial of the variances, a judgment by the circuit court that the applicant did not challenge with an appeal of the circuit to the Court of Special Appeals, that is a binding judgment. The only remedy for this court is to disapprove the application for the special exception, because there's no way you can square the special exception with the variance. Now, my adversary argues, well, the board's opinion gave the applicant wiggle room to adjust the plan, and I disagree with that. And that's why I took the board through the history of what they applied for, the variances they applied for, the 9 spaces beneath the building, the board's ruling on the same 9 spaces, the circuit court's affirmance of the denial of that variance for the 9 spaces, the failure of the applicant to appeal that decision. Now they can't, we assert, come into this body and say, we never needed those variances in the first place. So for those reasons, we assert that this body should disapprove, that is required to disapprove the special exception. The second question addresses the stay in the modified plan case. The board asked us to address the question of whether the stay in APL 2020-04 should continue until the circuit court has concluded its consideration on remand of the special exception case. And then the board also asked us to address whether the project may proceed in the absence of a special exception. We assert that there should be the stay should continue until all the subsequent appellate avenues are resolved. My clients have appealed to the Court of Special Appeals the circuit court's affirmance of the zoning boundary adjustment case. The zoning boundary case is making its way through the appellate system as we speak.
Mr. Nelson, you can stop there, I think, because we've scheduled argument on that for June 1st. We're going to hear argument on that June 1st.
I acknowledge what the board said. I was responding to the issue presented in the schedule.
The order scheduling the hearing for June 1st superseded that on that point.
All right. Well, I acknowledge what the board just said, and I'll move on to the next point, which is the parties should address whether the project may proceed in the absence of a special exception. And my answer is this project cannot, because it's over the 50 seats. It has a bar. If they want to come in with a proposal for a restaurant that's by right, that's 50 seats or less without a bar, they could do that, but that's going to require a new application, a new plan. With this plan, the answer is no, they cannot proceed without a special exception. So for all those reasons, I respectfully urge the board to find that given the ruling in the variance case affirmed by the circuit court, there's no way to square that ruling, that final judgment, with the approval of the special exception, and the special exception should be disapproved. Thank you.
Thank you. So, Mr. Christoff, you agree with all of that, right?
Not quite, Mr. Chairman. Good evening, Mr. Chairman, members of the board. I'm going to start with the last point first in the board's scheduling order. As the board's aware, Section 2164 540C3 requires a special exception for a restaurant of more than 50 seats and a bar. And our position is that if the board had intended to limit the restaurant to 50 seats, it should have denied the special exception. Instead, the special exception was approved by this board and affirmed by the circuit court. At page 11 of its opinion, the court said, the court finds that the protestants offer no legal basis to justify disturbing the decision of the Board of Appeals in this case. And they note the authorities and they say, accordingly, we decline to do so. This project cannot proceed as currently approved for 65 seats and a bar without a special exception. And as the board is aware, that approval was granted by the Director of Planning and Zoning for a modification. And as the chair has indicated, comes up for hearing on June 1. As a point of clarification, I thought that was not coming up on June 1, but June 19. Has that changed?
Jackie, do I have that wrong? Jackie?
I'm not positive. I have to pull up the agendas to verify that, so I will do that.
All right. Go ahead, Mr. Christopher. We'll get back to you on that.
Thank you. Thank you. So no legal basis to disturb the special exception, the court said, and the project cannot proceed as currently approved for 65 seats without a special exception. The court also affirmed the board's denial of the variance, and at page 23 of its opinion, the court noted that it is clear to the court that the board adequately considered physical limitations and the proposed development for various residential and commercial uses, including residential units, office units, and a 75-seat restaurant were unreasonable under the code. It's the applicant's position that the court did not find that a restaurant with a number of seats less than 75 would be unreasonable. And in fact, that leaves us with a question of how do we reconcile the denial of the variances with the approval of the special exception? The applicant's position is that the board's opinion granted the special exception subject to conditions which are included in its opinion. Specifically at page 5, the board unanimously concluded each of the criteria were met for the reasons set forth in the staff report with regard to the special exception. The board adopts those findings based on the evidence presented at the hearing. The special exception is granted subject to the conditions set forth in the staff report. I think it's important to look at the staff report to understand what those conditions allowed, starting with number 17. Special exception approval shall only be applicable to the premises so long as constructed and maintained in accordance with approved plans and conditions or any authorized changes thereto, and the approval shall cease and terminate upon any authorized changes from the approved plans. Condition 18 said, the use and operation of the special exception shall be in conformance with all applicable rules, regulations, codes, including but not limited to building, fire codes, health standards, police, and zoning regulations. Condition number 10, final site development plan shall be reviewed and approved by the Department of Planning and Zoning and Public Works prior to the issuance of grading or public permits. And finally, the last portion of the 9th condition, the parking management plan shall be reviewed and approved by the Department of Planning and Zoning and the Office of Law prior to the issuance of any permits for the project. Those conditions assured that a special exception for more than 50 seats, I'm sorry for squeaking, and a bar would be consistent with the denial of parking setback variance, and in fact anticipated the submittal of a modified plan that since has been submitted under the condition based on the 4 that I just read, that it would have to provide adequate parking without variances. So there's no inconsistency between the denial of the variances and the grant of the special exception. It's important to note that unlike my colleague's argument, the court did not vacate or reverse the board's approval of the special exception. It affirmed it, subject to further clarification. And at page 8 of its opinion, part of this was quoted by Mr. Nelson. It noted that the board failed to make necessary findings, but then remanded to the board for further clarification, not for a new determination, not for reversal, but for further clarification consistent with the court's ruling herein. And the court's ruling was to affirm the grant of the special exception. The board, I might note, has already made affirmative findings, which also were withstood a challenge that they weren't reasonably articulated at page 5 of its opinion. I'm sorry, page 5 of the I've lost my way. I'll move on here. The board made affirmative findings at page 5 of its opinion by adopting the standards of the Office of Planning and Zoning, which the court approved, notwithstanding that the protestants argued that they hadn't properly articulated their findings. The court said it was appropriate for the board to adopt the findings of staff. With regard to further clarification, it's our opinion that that clarification is found in the conditions imposed. In other words, in order to approve a new plan, the board has to assure that it meets the conditions imposed by the board, namely that it be in compliance with code and be approved the final site plan by staff. It's important also to note time-wise that this board had to be aware at the time of its vote on the special exception, because it had already denied the variances, that the number of seats would have to be reduced. But by not denying the special exception, it recognized that more than 50 seats were approved as long as the required parking was provided. A quote from the board's opinion, this came up at the with the colloquy between the chairman and Ms. Rouse. Ms. Rouse said, "I don't understand. If a variance is denied, I'm not sure they can meet the parking requirement for the proposed restaurant. So how does the denial of the variance then impact the ability to build this restaurant?" And Chairman Gallagher responded, "You'll have to work that out with them. We've denied the application for the variance, and we don't question that." Ms. Rouse, okay, so potentially then they would have to redesign in order to get the use. Chairman Gallagher, you would know that better than I. And that's exactly what has happened, obviously. The applicant has redesigned the use, has resubmitted it. There's no variances required, and that resubmittal has been approved by the Department of Planning and Zoning. Quoted another way, it's not inconsistent to deny variances which had the effect of reducing parking spaces while approving the special exception, but requiring that final development plans meet code by providing adequate parking for the seating proposed. In terms of the board has noted that it will hear this case either on the 1st or the 19th. So it's not necessary for me to go into whether or not the case should be continued, as the chairman has pointed out. In summary, I would just note that because of the conditions imposed, there is no inconsistency in approving a special exception for more than 50 seats while denying variances which would have allowed 75 seats. Those conditions assure that the final site plan, which has to be approved by the Department of Planning and Zoning, will meet code criteria. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Christoph. Joel, would you like to weigh in on this?
The city of Annapolis takes no position in this case. We believe that the court's order is clear, and we will leave it in the capable hands of the board and the board's counsel as to how to comply with the court's order.
Okay. Does Mr. Nelson feel the need for a rebuttal?
Yes, I'd like a brief rebuttal if that's permitted.
Brief is the key.
The applicant has argued to the board that the circuit court affirmed the grant of the special exception. I disagree. The circuit court did not affirm the special exception. If the circuit court had affirmed the special exception, we wouldn't be having this argument here tonight. The circuit court remanded the case to the board to address the disconnect between the variance ruling and the special exception ruling, which was predicated on the staff report, which said we can only approve the special exception if the variances are permitted. That was the disconnect. So I reject unequivocally the notion that the board the court affirmed the circuit court. But I'm trying now to make a legal argument, which is the premise of the application in the beginning, the premise of the first staff report, the premise of the litigation before the board was that the applicant was seeking, among other variances, a variance to have 9 parking spaces beneath the building at 424 4th Street. The board ruled on that, denied that request. The circuit court affirmed that denial. There was no appeal. And now the applicant's coming to the board and saying none of that matters. That adverse judgment has no meaning to us, that we don't need a variance for those 9 parking spaces. And we persuaded staff that we don't need it. And under the law, you can't undo an adverse judgment that you didn't challenge on appeal. So for all those reasons, on behalf of my citizen clients, I urge the board to disapprove the application for the special exception. If the applicant thinks it can get a restaurant permitted under different circumstances, well, let them come forward with a plan, and let's see what the plan is, and let's have an application that's consistent with the prior judgments in this case. So for all those reasons, I urge the board to disapprove the application for special exception on remand. Thank you.
Thank you. Any questions from board members for any of the council?
Yes, I have a question.
Yeah, go for it.
My question is to Mr. Nelson, and it's actually two questions, and I'm just going to ask them both at the same time. Can you direct me to any authority that says that the applicants cannot change, alter, or amend their plan once a special exception has been granted? Is question number one. And question number two is, can't we as the board, don't we have the authority to set whatever conditions we want upon a special exception, which is that it needs to conform with zoning guidelines, which would necessarily include parking, and therefore, if there is a number less than 75 but greater than 50, we can make that a condition of as a general proposition in a special exception.
I have an answer to each question. Let me take the first question first. And that really, I believe, is the subject of the APL 2020-004, whether there can be a modification to a plan. And we briefed that. We filed our papers in late January, and that's going to be on the docket for this hearing in June. And the short answer is there are some circumstances, not applicable here, where an applicant may, in certain circumstances, amend a plan. But I think that's going to be the issue for the June hearing. But we filed we filed those papers. And to be frank, I didn't prep that legal issue for this hearing. If you want, I could go back and look at that right now and address it, but I think that's going to be the narrow issue in June.
Okay.
All right, so the second question is, can an administrative zoning body such as the City of Annapolis Board of Appeals approve a special exception conditioned upon conformance with, for example, the parking requirements? I think that's your question, Mr. Burnett.
Yes, more or less in that, if the special exception is requesting a 75-seat restaurant and bar, can't we say, no, you're not allowed to have that because you're not going to meet the parking requirements? But to the extent you can find something less than 75 that would meet parking requirements, isn't that a condition that we as the board can set?
But in my land use practice, I think it's not uncommon for an administrative land use body to approve a special exception with conditions. I don't think it's good practice, but I think it's not an uncommon practice. But this case is different because what the applicant is saying is to the board, you approve this with conditions, we're modifying the plan, and here's our parking parking plan. And if we reduce the seats from, I think the current number is 65, and maybe off by 1 or 2, but if we reduce it from 75 to say 65, under the ordinance, we are required to have X number of parking spaces, and we meet it. So therefore, we're consistent with the board's condition that we satisfy the requirements. But they meet it because they put back into the mix the 9 parking spaces beneath the building that this board said you can't have, and which was affirmed by the circuit court, and which the applicant chose not to appeal to the Court of Special Appeals. So the problem here is that they're putting back into the mix these 9 parking spaces, which the court has ruled are not allowed by variance. And now they're saying we don't need a variance. And what I'm saying is, wait a minute, We spent 2 years litigating the question, and the citizens won it and the applicant lost it. You just can't ignore that adverse judgment. So to summarize, I think, yes, there are circumstances where a body such as your body can approve with a condition, but you can't put back into a mix a parking space, 9 parking spaces that the court has said you can't have. And that's what they're trying to do in this case.
Thank you, Mr. Nelson.
Other
I
questions?
would like to just add one point to Mr. Nelson that I don't, in my 11 years on the board, I don't think we've ever issued a variance without conditions. So it's not uncommon. Every variance that leaves our body leaves with conditions.
Mr. Walsh?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Maybe perhaps a follow-up. Just as a general statement, Mr. Nelson, are you contending that I've read both sections of the city code related to special exceptions and variances, and I don't find them necessarily being that where one would be with turning down one is going to necessarily defeat the other. Is that your general contention? That by virtue of the fact that the variance was defeated, that in essence defeats the special exception too? You're on mute.
Mr. Nelson, you need to unmute yourself.
Apologize. Let's start with Mr. Burnett's premise and Mr. Zazali's premise and your premise. We can approve a special exception with a condition, and the condition is that you meet the parking requirements. And what I'm saying is, okay, how are they meeting the parking requirements? There's a parking plan, and that parking plan includes 9 parking spaces beneath 424 4th Street. And the premise is we don't need a variance for that. That's a by right parking spot. And I'm saying, no. We spent 2 years litigating that issue. You applied for a variance. The board disapproved the variance. The court affirmed the disapproval. You can't just come back with a new plan and assume you don't need a variance. That's the law of the case that governs this body's analysis of the question of whether they need a variance for those 9 parking spaces. And if they don't get those 9 parking spaces, they can't get the restaurant for 65 seats.
Can they get the restaurant for 60 seats if they don't have the 9 spaces?
I don't have that arithmetic at my fingertips, but there's an answer to that question. I just don't have the answer at my fingertips. But yes, the reality is every time I lose a parking space, the size of the restaurant must go down.
Correct. So, I think, and to make a statement into a question, but I think part of the board's issue in making the determination as to the special exception was that we didn't have the ability while we were making our ruling to come up with the specific number of seats that they were allowed. And we kicked it to the city and said, they can have their special exception so long as parking is met, and whatever that number is, whether it's 51, 57, or 60 or 65, that's up to somebody else to decide and come up with that calculation. So isn't that issue one in which needs to be addressed with the city and not this board?
No, I disagree, because, well, we're gonna address it in the APL 2020-004 case. But this is the point I'm trying to make, and I'm not being clear enough. That a restaurant of 65 seats needs a certain number of parking spaces. What that number is now, I don't know, but it's a defined number. And the applicant comes here and says, we meet that requirement. And yes, if you look at the plan, you'll see that there are parking places on this plan that satisfy the number required for 65-seat restaurant. But my point is, they've put into that parking plan 9 parking spaces that the court has previously ruled you can't have without a variance. That's the point I'm making. So if you take the 9 out, you don't have the 65 seat restaurant.
Then it would fail. But isn't that a determination to be made by somebody other than this board? Because our ruling was in fact that they can have their special exception as long as they meet the parking. So therefore, the issue of the parking and the number of seats is for the city to determine. And the issue would be to take exception to the city's determination that they have in fact met the requirements they need without a variance, right?
We are challenging that. I promise you, we are challenging that. But let's talk about, I will say with this, with all due respect, you can't dodge this bullet. So here's my view of administrative law. An administrative body has to put on paper within the 4 corners of the decision what it decided and why. It must get the law right. It must articulate adequately what it did and why, and it can't be arbitrary and capricious. And so what we have is, if you look at the board's opinion, the board incorporates by reference the staff report. The staff report says we can only approve the special exception if we approve the variances. That's one of your findings. We can only approve the special exception if we approve the variances. You incorporated that into your decision, and then you disapprove the variances. So we have this disconnect within your opinion, and the only way you can undo that disconnect is to disapprove the special exception.
See, that's right. And that leads to my second observation is your use of the term disconnect. After reading the court decision and having sat through all the testimony and read all the evidence, and Mr. Christoph's recollection is consistent with mine, that the special exception came up after the defeat of the variance, and it was passed unanimously on the board with the conditions attached there too. So we had a pretty good idea that this special exception was going to be operating, if at all, it was ever going to come into play, it was going to be without the benefit of the variance that they saw. So I guess the question I have is, the court, you mentioned a few moments ago that we shouldn't act capriciously. And I believe the court, through its analysis, came to the conclusion that this board acted reasonably, both in the variance and in the special exception. And perhaps we're looking at it differently, but the language that I see is that it's not a disconnect, that we have to provide adequate articulation. That doesn't seem to me to be necessarily a disconnect.
Well, here's the disconnect. Staff report said, staff says we can only, the special exception can only be permitted if the variances are granted. The administrative body incorporated that factual finding into its opinion. That's we can go to the opinion. I can show it to you. It's there. And then you disapprove the variances. So that's the disconnect.
But isn't it here for us to articulate to the circuit court as to how we reached the conclusion to the special exception, and therefore we have the ability to correct that during our deliberations at the next meeting?
Yeah, I think the board's obligation is to issue a new decision, and you can't. I'm an advocate for citizens, you know, and I'm sensitized to the standard review, and you can't just reverse a decision. You can't just say, here we incorporate a staff report into our findings, and here we don't. You have two contradictory statements. So I don't see how this body can correct the opinion and conform with Maryland's jurisprudence with respect to how an administrative body writes an administrative decision.
I don't know. Can you just go back to the comment you just made about standard review? Are you positing that we didn't properly apply the standard review when it came to special exceptions? Because the court agreed that we acted reasonably and we applied the proper standard review, if I read the court's decision correctly.
I'm sorry. So you broke up there just for a second. Would you mind repeating that? I beg your
Sure, yeah, you mentioned something about the standard review. Are you positing that we didn't apply the proper standard review as regards to the special exception? Because, I mean, the way I read the court's decision, I have it right here, is that we did apply the proper standard review. We acted reasonably based on the wealth of evidence in front of us and presented to us. And I'm not sure I quite understand where you went from there.
Okay, so when I use the phrase standard review, that's shorthand for me. I incorporate the requirements to articulate what the body did and why. It incorporates the correct application of the law. It incorporates substantial evidence for its factual findings. It incorporates the notion that the decision is not arbitrary and capricious. So when I use that for standard review, that's my shorthand for those legal themes. My point here is that I don't see how this administrative body can cure the error by simply rewriting the opinion, because to rewrite the opinion, the board would have to say, well, you know, we were totally wrong last time. We were totally wrong about the variance. We didn't need a variance for the 420, the 9 places beneath the 424. And here's why. The trouble with that is it's in conflict with what the first decision, this board's first decision said explicitly, and it's in conflict with what the circuit court ruled, with which the applicant did not appeal, to which the applicant did not appeal. So I think it's sort of, with all due respect to the board, I think the board's tied in a knot here. I think you got a problem. I think the only way out is to disapprove the special exception.
But isn't disapproving the special exception exactly what you're saying we can't do, which is to totally reverse what we've already done? The court has asked us to articulate why we did what we did. You're asking us to undo the granting of the special exception. So I'm confused as to how you can have it both ways and say we can't undo something and then ask us to specifically undo what we did, which was the granting of the special exception.
Well, I think that when the scenario outlined, Mr. Burnett, was consistent with the variance ruling, consistent with this board's reliance on the staff report, which said the special exception can only be granted if the variances are granted. So I think, I don't know how I can say it any clearer. I think that the only remedy is to disapprove it, because there's a final judgment that they need 9 parking spaces. Correction, there's a final judgment that they required a variance for those 9 places beneath the building, and that was disapproved, and the court affirmed that disapproval, and there was no appeal. And now they're trying to rely on those same 9 parking spaces.
Got it. Thank you, Mr. Nelson.
Any more questions from the board? That's the right answer. All right, thank you very much for your briefs and your argument. I think the board has a tough job here. I think the council had a tough job in drafting this complicated code where you've got so many approvals and it's not clear what order you get them in and what conditions you can attach to which. And I think our job is to try to make sense out of what the council's done. So that's the approach I'll be taking when we gather again on the 1st to decide how we want to respond to the circuit court. Jackie, have you figured out when we schedule the argument on the appeal?
The appeal is on the agenda for June 1st.
Yeah, that's what I thought.
And then I think we continued this item to the next meeting after that.
No, we're deliberating this on June 1st before we hear the argument of appeal. That was my recollection.
Okay, let me also double check that and I will get back to you.
Okay. All right, we'll excuse counsel for the parties in 2018-003. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Good night.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, our last thing tonight goes to our proposed revisions of the board's rules. You know, we have a provision in the rules themselves that set certain requirements for us when we amend our rules. And then the city council recently passed a ordinance that sets a somewhat more complicated procedure for the city's boards and commissions, requiring them to adopt rules and prescribing how they go about doing that. My recollection of reading that and discussing it with the alderman who sponsored it was that it's not effective until July 1st. And so I have tried to schedule the procedure for adoption of our rules so they'll become effective before July 1st, so we're not formally subject to those new requirements. Having said that, the procedure that I've laid out for us to follow is my best attempt to comply with the substance of our own rules and the rules in the new legislation. Otherwise, it would have been up for debate and adoption weeks ago. So, consistent with that procedure, we had published the rules in the newspaper and on the city's website, and notice was on the agenda that we were going to talk about them tonight, and they'll be coming up again for our next meeting. We set a deadline for comments on the proposal for 2 days ago, 17th. So we have them in advance of this meeting. And my understanding is we received no public comments during the comment period. However, Jackie advises me that one or more citizens have indicated they do have comments. And so my response to them through Jackie or now is that the comment period is closed. We're not going to reopen it, but we want to hear whatever anyone has to say. We don't want to make a mistake. If someone thinks we're making a mistake, send in a comment. We'll look at it even though the comment period is closed. And then the idea is that we will discuss it. We'll discuss any comments we get, and we'll have our deliberations and vote on adopting the new rules at our meeting on the 1st of June. So that's all I have to report on that. Anything anyone wants to discuss about the process or anything now? Okay.
Bob, before we go, I neglected to put that one public testimony that came in for the remand in the record, and that would be 2-1.
Yeah, that's a comment. That's part of the file in that case.
Okay.
Thanks, Tammy.
Thank you.
Okay, Jackie, were you going to get back to us on?
I'm getting back. I have the remand continued to June 16th and the appeal hearing on June 1st. And I can't remember why that was decided. And maybe I made a mistake, but that's the way it was advertised on the agenda that went out for tonight's meeting, that it was continued to June 16th.
Let's amend the agenda. Let's get it over with. The idea in scheduling it was that we would make our decision on how to respond to the demand. And that could influence how we respond to the other appeal, whether we decide then that we want to continue it.
Okay, we haven't published the June 1st agenda yet, so I can add it to the June 1st agenda. When I said it's on the agenda we had for tonight, said it was continued to June 16th. That's what I was saying, but I can change that
Yeah, go.
and put that on before we hear the appeal. And
Right.
I will send out an email to everyone tomorrow confirming those facts.
Okay. And then do we have anything else on the agenda for the first? We got deliberation.
We have a special exception for 82 Maryland Avenue. It's should not be a big complex case. It's for the Rasa Juice woman to relocate to a new location. She's already on Maryland Avenue, but she wants to expand and so that she can do preparation. So it's coming in as a delicatessen approval, and she's going to have seats in there, 10 seats.
And this is Cynthia, you have the continuation of tonight's variance.
Yeah, we've got, right, so that's 5 things.
So we'll hear the continuation of 1001 Moss Haven Court first, and then second, we will hear the continuation of the remand case, and then we'll hear Rasa Juice, and then we have the appeal. And let me just double check to make sure that so I have to go into my other alternative location to look up the agendas.
And then we'll have the vote on the rules.
Yes, we have the continuation of the rules hearing also. So we have, that is 5 things. And I don't think there's anything else, but I am going to, pull up the agendas again. Every time I have to go into my workspace to access the agenda, so it's a little more complicated than,
So one of you guys can be preparing that all important ultimate motion.
well, maybe you all should vote on who's going to do that. That would take some time.
Oh, no, I'd be happy to make that motion right now.
See, now you have volunteers, Bob.
Well, I move that we adjourn.
Okay, just let me pull up the agenda. I'm really close.
I see a second.
It's a labyrinth getting to files.
The hammer is coming down.
Oh, okay, Bob, it's loading right now. I just want to make sure we don't have anything else on that agenda that has already been advertised. I don't think we do. And we don't.
Second. the
All in
motion.
favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Thank you all very much and good night.
Everyone.